We do have an idea because we have a record, a pretty good written record of a man named Charles Farrar Brown, who was born in Waterford, Maine, who went under the pen name of Artemus Ward. Bill Pullen wrote this book called A Comic Relief about Charles Farrar Brown. He was Abraham Lincoln's favorite humorist. He was the man who first published Mark Twain's work when he was the editor of Vanity Fair, and he was born in 1834.
All right, here's the thing about Artemus Ward. I've read some of that stuff.
It doesn't seem funny.
It's not funny. It doesn't hold up.
But if you read Bill Pullen's book, the key to Artemus Ward is understanding he was the first American stand-up comic, and the stuff that he did, there's a lot of stand-up comics whose work wouldn't translate into the written word because they're keying off the audience. Like Artemus Ward invented this for quotes. Huh. Okay, so stuff like that. Yep. And he had all these dioramas. And when he was riffing off of stuff that was in the culture then that isn't in the culture now, which is part of this whole thing. Parker Fennelly, you say Parker Fennelly, people don't know who he was. But he was Titus Moody on Allen's Alley, on radio, and he made the transition. He was right at the cusp of the 30s and 40s into the early 50s, and he did television. And his end of his career was the Pepperidge Farm guy.
So he was the classic dry-humored New Englander.
But the key here, Rob, is what all these people did, whether it's Parker Fennelly, whether it's Holman Day, whether it's Artemus Ward, they put on the persona of the dry old Yankee, and that's what has continued as the connective thread through, whether it was in the 1850s, whether it was in Holman Day in 1910. I've recorded his stuff on my album, The Tale of the Kennebec Mariner, Aunt Shaw's Pet Jug. A wonderful Holman Day poem is called The Only Man I Ever Knew I Really Killed, and it was about the Civil War soldier who was so scared at the battle that he turned and ran away from the Confederate soldier, and ran so far that the Confederate soldier had a heart attack and died behind.
So you've done that for many years. Yes. You've channeled that. What is it that makes that so funny? Is it just that people connect with that persona?
Well, for one thing, the core of Down East humor is a lot like British humor for a reason, because it got sort of imported with the first British invasion. But there's a level of sort of philosophical detachment that comes with Maine, because here we are, this sort of barnacle stuck on the hull of the country, up in the upper right-hand corner, away from everything. And it's always been true that rusticators and vacationers and politicians come through, people come and go with the tide, but we're here like the barnacle on the rock. And so we see the passing parade. And one of the great tropes of American rural humor is observing the passing parade from the point of view of the little country store or the lobsterman coming in off the dock and seeing. So what's great for storytelling is you have the detached narrator kind of, well, I've seen that, they come up through here last time. And of course, there's always a little dialect and eclectic, small town perspective.
Well, you've been a piece of Maine's 200 years. You had an epiphany.
Yes, I was doing the math and I realized Maine is 200 years old, and for more than a third of Maine's history, I've been here. I haven't been performing the whole time, but I mean, it's not the new anything, it's just old.
So when you're doing your shows around the state this year, do you got a lot of them coming up? Are you going to be sort of tying in some bicentennial themes?
Yes, I've been specifically asked to do that. So I'm doing shows at places like the Opera House in Boothbay Harbor and Gunquit Performing Arts Center, the Westbrook Performing Arts Center, and these shows that people have said, I'm doing one up in Pembroke in April for a benefit for the Washington County Fair, and all these shows, people have asked me if there's a way I can tie in the bicentennial theme, because it is the bicentennial, and I thought this would be a great way to do it. And just like you said, people say, what translates from 200 or 150? Well, some stuff does, some stuff falls by the wayside. There was a lot of, they were still having minstrel shows in Maine in my childhood, blackface minstrel shows. So where does that, what remains, what falls away, what's elemental. What is, when you listen to these bicentennial minutes that are on the media now, there's, it talks about, the Civil War days and who was for slavery and who was a slaveholder and all that. That's the real history. And what falls by the wayside and what remains is an interesting part of the story.
So what do you think is one of the most important pieces that you need to include in your shows?
I think what I'm trying to find is that connective thread. What is it that Artemus Ward would have done in the 1850s that Holman Day would have done in the early part of the 20th century, that Parker Fenley would have done on Allen's Alley, that Marshall Dodge and Bob Bryant would do in the 50s and 60s, that I would do in my career, that Bob Marley would do? What is it that is the common thread? Because then I think if you look at it that way, what you're looking at is the essence of what's the culture of Maine or the persona of Maine. And one of the things I do think is it's very self-contained and dry. I always say, it ain't that it ain't funny, you just don't get it. And a lot of times, it's easy to miss. But then when you're driving home, half an hour later, you start busting up and go, oh, that's what he was talking about. And I'll bet that was what the Artemus Ward shows were like. I bet they were they were easy to laugh at in the moment you were listening, hard to describe to somebody who wasn't there.
It's interesting because Tim's a performer. He's not a historian, but I would wager there's really no one in Maine who knows the history of humor and storytelling as deeply as he does.
I agree. And I love hearing him talk about how that Maine humor is a dry humor, because growing up in Maine, I mean, it's so true. That's how people just talk to each other.
Your humor is.
Maine girl.
It is. If you'd like to see a list of shows where you can see Tim Sample perform, just head to our website or mobile app.